So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Alistair, and we move on to our conversation with Γκίκας Χαρδούβελης, who's familiar to you in this conference, but also brings multiple distinguished perspectives to this topic as a distinguished economist, author of many econometric papers, as a former finance minister, and of course now as a banker chairman of the board of National Bank of Greece. We're going to look at the macro picture above all. Let's start with the first bullet point, actually, of the session, thinking about the European financial landscape in times of turmoil. Certainly turmoil is what it is. Do you think a recession is now almost inevitable? Is it baked in? Are your models blinking red to you, or what?
Well, Dan, thank you. I mean, one does not have a crystal ball when it comes to forecasting. However, what we do see is a substantial deceleration of economic activity. Everybody knows this. Global GDP in 2021 was like 5.8%. It's going to go down to 3%, and about half of it is due to the war. It was already there before the war started. And I guess the question about a recession is a question for year 2023, the last quarter of 2022 and later. And it will be a function of the developments of the war, I think. Since you mentioned econometrics, my favorite guide is the yield curve. This is research I've done 30 years ago, and it has never failed in the predictions of recession, which is the difference between the 10-year yield and the 3-month rate. If in 2 quarters in a row it's negative, then the recession is coming. Now it's not showing recession, this particular number. Of course.
I just want to be clear on that, since it's an important.
Yeah.
So you say it's never failed. Does that mean that when it's 2 quarters negative, there's always been a recession? But does it also mean that if it doesn't show that, there isn't a recession?
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
This is an important difference.
Yes. Because it's very rare that the yield curve does turn negative, and the times when it was negative and it was not a recession, it was close to a recession anyway.
Okay.
So since that particular number is not negative, I'm less worried. Of course, there's always a probability of recession. I mean, professional forecasters think there is 35% probability in the US that we will have a recession. In Europe, they say about the same, 33% probability. And nobody can tell, because we don't know how drastic the reaction of the central banks will be. And everybody's nervous about this. We heard this morning that they may overreact because they were too late in their response. They were too comfortable. They thought they were very credible, and they had established that the market believed them and they will stick around the 2% target, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems like they ran behind the curve. They were behind the curve. So we need to follow them and see how they respond. And also, the attitude they have. Are they willing to sacrifice growth in order to fight inflation or not? And I'd say, because I also lived the 1970s, I still remember Jimmy Carter, for example, in the late 70s, addressing the nation and saying, inflation is the moral equivalent of war. And lo and behold, Paul Volcker actually did it for him, but at the cost of a recession, the cost of a big...
Very painful.
Yeah, it was very painful. Now, this time around, I think we're a little bit better off relative to the 1970s. And that's because advanced economies are not as sensitive to petroleum and to energy. They're not, the GDP is not so energy intensive as it was 40 years ago. Central banks, we may accuse them, we may nag about them, but I think they are in a lot better shape than they were 40 years ago. They are more independent than they were 40 years ago. They have their act together, I believe. I mean, we can always nitpick on them, but I think they're doing a good job. And finally, we're still at a very early stage. Now we're at the unanticipated inflation, where all of a sudden we're finding out. The question is, will it enter into our expectations about the future, and will this affect wages? Will it enter the wage, will it become a wage price spiral, as it had happened 50 years ago, and it took a big effort to fight it? I think there is another element that makes it unlikely, which is workers are not as united anymore as they used to be. I mean,
not unionized.
Not only in the U.S. The U.S., there were 20% of them were unionized. Now it's only 10%. In Italy, 50% of them were unionized. Now it's like 1/3. Everywhere, somehow, everybody became too comfortable with the low inflation level, even at the level of wage negotiations. Everybody believed there's not going to be inflation. Remember about this affected interest rates, and everybody said, my God, we're having low interest rates, low for longer. This was the buzzword a year ago or 2 years ago. So we just entered this big new phase. The people and the households are a little bit more worried than professional forecasters or the central bankers about inflation, because they feel it. I mean, if you look at surveys that the ECB is doing, you will realize that, and they ask them, what's the rate of inflation in the last 12 months? And we know what the rate of inflation was, for example, 2 months ago. It was like 6% the last 2 months. Well, they say, the most rich, they say 8%. The more poor, whose pocket is affected more, they say 12%. So everybody perceives inflation based on their experience, and households do perceive it. Unanticipated inflation helps debtors and hurts households and people on fixed income.
So just to play devil's advocate a little bit for you, I mean, I won't go on to the central banks because we had that discussion this morning. I think yes. Mohamed Arian was less confident than you in the central bankers, but we'll leave that aside.
Yeah, I'll say he's watching the stock market and he doesn't like it. I mean, he wants the stock market to be, but anyway, let's leave it.
Okay, let's move on from that. Just on the question of the response in wage negotiations, it's of course true that unionization is much lower, organized labor is less powerful than it used to be, but isn't it possible that you get a sort of dynamic emerging for precisely the reasons that you say, that people, ordinary households are feeling this, they sense it, and therefore the pressure for wage negotiations could become much stronger than people have experienced really for many years, and you start to get, if you're a union and you see all the other unions striking, you perhaps become more militant as well.
Of course, no, it can easily happen. That's why it's critical that inflation is prevented in its beginning. Remember, it could be a supply-driven inflation, but it could become expectations-driven inflation if it's allowed to stay for a while. And I think, although central bankers are not old enough to remember the 1970s, some of them, realize it and they'll fight it off.
So it leads, I think, and this is not just for central bankers, this is for economic policymakers more broadly. What is the art of the possible to address the very real concerns of households in this difficult situation, to try to support, particularly in the energy area, but more broadly as well? What can you do that both alleviates concerns but does not set off an inflationary spiral?
I think it's targeted measures. At least the Greek government is doing that. It's trying to alleviate the burden, especially on the poor households. So, I mean, I think governments are quite sophisticated even today. Even the Greek government is quite sophisticated. They have learned their lesson from the previous crisis. and they're following a correct path.
So what would you be targeting? You would target about those vulnerable households, particularly.
Vulnerable households.
Pensioners in particular, yes. Those on the lowest
yes.
income.
And perhaps small companies that in Greece, the energy cost is way too high.
Yeah.
Higher than in Europe. But I guess we shouldn't talk only about Greece. This is an international phenomenon.
Well, I wanted to separate things actually between the global, the European, and the Greek, because the outlook, you know, usually in this conference we're talking about a situation or an outlook in Greece which has been particularly problematic compared with the rest of Europe. This year we're looking at the opposite. The Greek situation seems to be better than for many countries, which is a pleasant situation to be in.
The Greek situation, I mean, for the government, inflation is great because the debt to GDP is going to be reduced. I expect at the end of 2022 the debt to GDP to go down from 193% to lower 170s.
Yeah, a little bit of inflation is a good thing.
A little bit of inflation is a good thing. You don't want the unanticipated inflation to become anticipated.
Right.
So that's the trick. You don't want it for too long because it's going to really affect the population. It's going to affect everybody, and it's not good.
So I wanted to ask you about the dependencies between the U.S., policy in the U.S. and Europe, and then Europe and Greece. So if we, you know, if the Fed gets it wrong, how possible is it for Europe to avoid catching this cold that would be started in America?
Yeah, the Fed got it wrong. I was surprised that President Biden had an expansionary fiscal policy right in the beginning, after Trump already had an expansionary fiscal policy. And a lot of people in the Democratic Party, including Larry Summers, I remember, complained about it. The Fed got it wrong. Even the hawks at the Fed, I heard them, they tried to justify the Fed being behind the curve. They said, but we have forward guidance. Yes, we know we're behind, but we have told the market what we do. And so far, they're okay when it comes to 5 years ahead. I mean, that inflation is more or less anchored. It only, you know, the target is 2%. It has only gone up to like 2.4%. So the problem is the next 12 months. And the fear is that we underestimate that if we don't catch that 12-month inflation early on, it may enter into the wage price spiral we were discussing.
Yeah.
So the Fed, now the fear is it may be too aggressive. It would have to be aggressive. Usually the Fed is a lot more aggressive than the ECB. The ECB turned out to be more prudent. It's kind of being composed of 19 countries. I guess you get different points of view. You end up following the right path, I think. They have struggled with these questions. We had the Eurozone crisis, so they're more ready, I guess.
So within that, what's the margin for maneuver for Greece? I mean, obviously, you know, buffeted by the power of the U.S. economy, and then within the Eurozone, much less maneuver than there would have been in times past. But what can Greece do to gird itself against this?
Greece should follow a credible policy. That's very important. We learned this lesson from the crisis. And I think policy is credible. Greece now is composed of households who understand the problem of the state sector, that the state cannot simply give out goodies if they want. They have companies that have survived the deep recession. We as bankers have noticed that, for example, in the beginning of COVID, when the government was giving out a lot of support and a lot of privileges, like Gefira 1, Gefira 2, bridge, whatever, a lot of our customers who had borrowed money from us, although they could have gotten the extra money from the state sector, they didn't bother. And we didn't see NPEs going up. We're following NPEs now. We're following them every day. We have the weekly number, and they haven't gone up. So, in fact, we're going through the summer now. Tourism is doing great. So I don't expect any problems. If anything, we will really see, if things turn sour, we're going to start feeling it only in the fourth quarter and afterwards. Okay, well, and hopefully by then, the politics with Ukraine may have solved themselves. And
well, let's hope for that. But I'm pleased to hear your optimism on the Greek economy and the management of the Greek economy. Our time is now virtually up, so I just want to return to your, put your economist hat on. I want to ask you, what do you follow particularly closely now? Which maybe 2 or 3 indicators do you look at most avidly? You mentioned the yield curve. I'm sure you still look at that.
Sure.
But what just as a hint for the rest of us in this room, what should we be looking at?
I do follow economic sentiment. It's still positive. The PMI is above 50. It's declining, but it's still above 50, which means there is optimism among companies. I follow everything. I mean,
difficult to follow everything.
Yeah.
But
well, you know, what I do is I follow what the different chief economists of the various banks say. They tend to be, to tell you the truth, a lot more optimistic than our central bank is. For some reason, our central bank is more optimistic about 2023 than 2022. And the private economists are worried about 2023, and not so. They think the inertia will bring a lot of growth in 2022.
And you heard the finance minister being sort of deliberately cautious in his forecast.
It's amazing. We were talking about credibility, a sign of how credible now the government has become. The finance minister is one of the most pessimistic forecasters. It's unbelievable, which is okay for him because he has to make sure the rest of the ministries are not overspending. So he's the policeman of the government. So that's his role. So he has to keep expectations low. So that's how he will be successful.
Well, I'm going to let you into a little secret here of who I follow religiously. And that is my colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit, who, of course, are not professionally optimistic or pessimistic. They're professionally realistic. So that's why I'm going to hand over now to Joan to take us through into the last session. But thank you very much. I've enjoyed that conversation, as I'm sure everybody else has. Thank you.